Welcome to the Archive of Nations, home of the custodians of the sacred records from time immemorial. Please subscribe and press the notification button as we have many lessons to educate and empower with a correct narrative of the past to create a lawful blueprint for the future. Welcome to part 16 of the Fallacy of Greece and Rome, entitled This is Sparta, Carbon Organic Sparta, where we follow the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans as they maintain their control in the Peloponnesus and the wider region under the influx of the hordes of admixture tribes descending from the north and entering from the east. In the webisode, Heracles the Carbon Organic Phoenician, we provide the reality that this is a story of modern racists, who made up the story of a foreign invasion from the north to support their preconceptions that contemporary inhabitants of Greece were a separate race from the carbon organic indigenous inhabitants of the Peloponnese Peninsula. The Dorians were supposedly the whiter-than-white Aryans, the master race from Northern Europe, and some Nazi-era and pre-Nazi German discussions of the subject literally have the Dorians going to Greece from Germany. The idea that Spartans thought of themselves as foreigners is a modern invention. Foreigners enslaving the Greek population is a distortion of something real, the carbon organic Spartans' enslavement of the hybrid Asian albino Helots, which was partly an ethnic thing, as Sparta's Helots in both Laconia and Messenia were Hellenes within the slave class, which also consisted of carbon organic slaves via war, conquest, trade, and land debt. It is a fallacy that Caucasian Europeans are the only people whom have a history of enslavement of others as carbon organic tribes. Families and clans erroneously referred to as black people also engaged in various forms of enslavement for millennia way before the creation of the hybrid Asian albino. Not that this is a competition in who can be most wicked to fellow members of humanity, but these realities must be revealed so together we can address the issues of an unbalanced world. These Helots were considered foreign due to their ancient Yamnaya admixture and due to this admixture with the carbon organic tribes, and it became a simple issue of keeping the royal lines of nobility and the matriarchal and matrilineal genetic lineages pure and traced back to those carbon organic deities that seeded and cultivated this realm, called planet Earth. The story that the Dorians came from up north and conquered the Peloponnesus got twisted in the 19th century into a story of a superior hybrid Asian albino race from Northern Europe overcoming the carbon organic inferior races down south. As Professor Rebecca Footo Kennedy puts it, as with many a historical myth about the origins of various Greek cultures, this one has a source in Herodotus and was an attempt by mostly German scholars at first. It seems to explain the changes in language from ancient African to Indo-European Hellenic. The mysterious Pelasgians appear as a native substrate of African and Anatolian origin. Hitler and many a German firmly believed that Spartans/Dorians and Germans were one people and that the martial valor and glory of Greece was the result of Germans invading Greece and establishing a civilization. They believed, and many still do, especially amongst radical right-wing groups and dispersed into the wider education curriculum, that the modern Germans were both the progenitors of ancient Greek civilization and its heirs. Continuing on from the webisode entitled The Return of the African Heraclidae, we explored the carbon organic lineages whom produced the Heraclidae, who thus became practically masters of Peloponnesus, who proceeded to distribute its territory among them by lot. According to myth, the first king of the region later to be called Laconia, but then called Leligio, was the eponymous King Lelix. The Leligid were the descendants of Lelix, ancestor of the Leliges, an ancient carbon organic tribe inhabiting the Eurotas Valley before the incoming carbon organic tribes from the east and the south, who, according to the mythological descent, amalgamated with the Greeks. The Leliges were an aboriginal people of the Aegean region before the pre-Hellenic Greeks arrived. They were distinct from another pre-Hellenic people of the region, the Pelasgians. Many Greek authors link the Leliges to the Carians of southwest Anatolia. Homer names the Leliges among the Trojan allies alongside the Carians, Pelasgians, Paeonians, and Caucans. The Caucans were an autochthonous tribe of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who later migrated to parts of the Greek mainland Arcadia, Trifilian Pylus, and Elis. The phonology of the name Caucans has been taken as evidence for an origin in the Caucasus Mountains. It is also suggested that they are related to the late Bronze Age Kaskians, who Hittite tablets locate along the southern shore of the Black Sea. The There were loosely affiliated Bronze Age non-Indo-European tribal people who spoke the unclassified Kaskian language and lived in mountainous East Pontic Anatolia, known from Hittite sources. They are sometimes identified with the Caucans known from Greek records. According to Herodotus and other classical era writers, the Caucans were among the tribes displaced or absorbed by the Bithynians, who had migrated from Thrace. This suggests that the Bithynians spoke an Indo-European language, while the Caucans did not. The Iliad lists the Caucans among the Trojan allies. In Book X, the Trojan herald Dolon describes their homeland as towards the sea and mentions them alongside the Carians, Paeonians, Leleges, and Pelasgians. In the Odyssey 3.366, Athena tells Nestor at Pylos that she will go to the Caucans, where there's an old debt still owing me, not a small amount. This allusion may refer to a subgroup of Caucans who had migrated to mainland Greece, as reported by Strabo. In Homer's Iliad, the Leleges are allies of the Trojans, 10.429, though they do not appear in the formal catalogue of allies in Book 2 of the Iliad, and their homeland is not specified. They are distinguished from the Carians, with whom some later writers confused them. Alcaeus, 7th or 6th century BCE, calls Antandrus in the Troadla Legion, but later Herodotus substitutes the epithet Pelasgian, so perhaps the two designations were broadly synonymous for the Carbon Organic pre-Hellenic Greeks. According to Homer, the Leleges were a distinct Anatolian tribe. However, Herodotus states that Leleges had been an early name for the Carians. Often historians assume, as a general rule, that autochthonous inhabitants survive an invasion as an underclass where they do not retreat to mountain districts, so it is interesting to hear in Deep Nosophisti that Philippus of the Angela, a 4th century BC historian, referred to Leleges still surviving as serfs of the true Carians, and even later Strabo attributes to the Leleges a distinctive group of deserted forts and tombs in Caria that were still known in his day as Lelegian forts. Herodotus 1.171 says that the Leleges were a people who in old times dwelt in the islands of the Aegean and were subject to Minos of Crete, one of the historic references that led Sir Arthur Evans to name the pre-Hellenic Cretan culture Minoan, and that they were driven from their homes by the Dorians and Ionians, after which they took refuge in Caria and were named Carians. Later the Achaeans, associated with Mycenaean Greece, immigrated from the north and replaced the Lelegians as ruling tribe. Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, would marry Menelaos and thus invite the Atridae to the Laconian throne. In the end, the Heraclidae, commonly identified with the Dorians, would seize the land and the throne of Laconia and found the city-state of Sparta proper. The last Atridae, Tisamenus and Pentheus, according to myth, would lead the Achaeans to Achaea and Asia Minor, whereas the Heraclids Eurysthenes and Proclus founded the Spartan kingly families of the Aegeid and Eurypontid dynasties, respectively. Eurysthenes was king of Sparta and one of the Carbon Organic Heraclidae in Greek mythology. He had a twin brother, Proclus. Together they received the land of Lacedaemon after Cresphontes, Timanus, and Aristodemus defeated Tisamenus, the last Achaean king of the Peloponnesus. Eurysthenes was the father of his successor, Agis I, founder of the Aegeid dynasty of the kings of Sparta. The story of the double kingship of Sparta begins with the uprising within the Peloponnesus by the Dorians, under these three Heraclid commanders, Timanus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus, the three sons of Aristomachus. Karl Ottfried Müller collected and evaluated the various fragments of the story from classical authors. The three commanders divided that which they did not yet possess, Peloponnesus. Following the signs of the gods, Aristodemus received Sparta. Argos fell to Timanus, Lacedaemon to Proclus and Eurysthenes, the twin sons of Aristodemus, and Messenia to Cresphontes. The fertile district of Elis had been reserved by agreement for Oxylus. The Heraclidae ruled in Lacedaemon until 221 BCE, but disappeared by title through admixture much earlier in the other countries. This conquest of Peloponnesus by the Dorians, commonly called the Dorian invasion or the return of the Heraclidae, which we have shown in previous webisodes was an internal uprising, is represented as the recovery by the Carbon Organic descendants of Heracles of the rightful inheritance of their hero ancestor and his sons. Tertius, an archaic-era Spartan writer, is the earliest source to connect the origin myth of the Spartans to the lineage of the hero Heracles. Later authors, such as Diodorus Siculus, Herodotus, and Apollodorus, also made mention of Spartans understanding themselves to be descendants of Heracles. The Spartan kings as Heraclidae claimed descent from Heracles, who through his mother was descended from Perseus. Disallowed the Peloponnesus, Hercules embarked on a life of wandering. The Heraclidae became ascended in the Eurotas Valley with the Dorians who, at least in legend, entered it during an invasion called the Return of the Heraclidae, driving out the Atrids and at least some of the Mycenaean population. In Greek mythology, Menelaus was a Greek king of pre-Dorian Mycenaean Sparta. According to the Iliad, Menelaus was a central figure in the Trojan War, leading the Spartan contingent of the Greek army under his elder brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, both prominent in both the Iliad and Odyssey. Pelops was a king of the Elean city of Pisa and the eponymous overlord of the western Peloponnesos, the so-called island of Pelops. He later traveled across the sea to Greece to compete for the hand of Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaeos of Pisa. Pelops quickly grew his empire and came to control most of the western Peloponnesos. His rival in the east was King Perseus of Argos, but the two houses formed an alliance with the marriage of the daughters of Pelops to the sons of Perseus. Pelops was one of the most important founding kings of myth. His descendants included Heracles, Eurystheus, Theseus, Atreus, Agamemnon, and Menelaus. The Virgilian commentator Servius wrote that the Tuti, or Pelops, the king of the Pisatans, arrived on the Tyrrhenian coast after the Trojan War and founded the Italian and more famous Pisa in the 13th century BCE. Menelaus was a descendant of Pelops, meaning dark face / ith son of Tantalus. The Menelaean is a shrine associated with Menelaus, located east of Sparta, by the river Eurotas. Built around the early 8th century BC, the Spartans believed it had been the former residence of Menelaus. In 1970, the British school in Athens started excavations around the Menelaean in an attempt to locate Mycenaean remains in the area. Among other findings, they uncovered the remains of two Mycenaean mansions and found the first offerings dedicated to Helen and Menelaus. These mansions were destroyed by earthquake and fire, and archaeologists consider them the possible palace of Menelaus himself. For most of its history, the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta in the Peloponnese was ruled by kings. Sparta was unusual among the Greek city-states in that it maintained its kingship past the Archaic Age. It was even more unusual in that it had two kings simultaneously, who were called the Archagatai, coming from two separate lines. According to tradition, the two lines, the Agiads and Eurypontids, were respectively descended from the twins Eurysthenes and Proclus, the descendants of Heracles, who supposedly conquered Sparta 2 generations after the Trojan War. The dynasties themselves, however, were named after the twins' grandsons, the kings Agus I and Euripon, respectively. The Agiad line was regarded as being senior to the Eurypontid line. Ancient Greeks named males after their fathers, producing a patronymic with the suffix "id." For example, the sons of Atreus were the Atrids. In Greek mythology, Atreus was a king of Mycenae in the Peloponnese, the son of Pelops and Hippodamia, and the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus. Collectively, his descendants are known as Atridae or Atridae. For royal houses, the patronymic was formed from the name of the founder or of an early significant figure of a dynasty. A ruling family might thus have a number of dynastic names. For example, Agus I named the Agiads, but he was a Heraclid and so were his descendants. The Heraclidae or Heraclids were the numerous descendants of Heracles, especially applied in a narrower sense to the descendants of Hyllus, the eldest of his 4 sons. Other Heraclidae included Macaria, Lamos, Manto, Biener, Lipolymus, and Telephus. Since Karl Ottfried Muller's Die Dorier, 1830, English translation 1839, Chapter 3, their rise to dominance has been associated with a misappropriated Dorian invasion. Though details of genealogy differ from one ancient author to another, the cultural significance of the mythic theme, that the descendants of Heracles, exiled after his death, returned some generations later to reclaim land that their ancestors had held in Mycenaean Greece, was to assert the primal legitimacy of a traditional ruling clan that traced its origin, thus its legitimacy, to Heracles. In the historical period, several dynasties claimed descent from Heracles, such as the Agiads and Eurypontids of Sparta, or the Timonids of Macedonia. They were presumed to have been named after kings and divinities, as kings often became divinities in their religion. Athens had its Solon, the lawgiver, and Sparta, its Lycurgus. Plutarch tells the story of Lycurgus, an 11th generation descendant of Hercules, since the Greeks generally ascribed genealogy that went back to the gods when writing about important figures. As previously discussed, in Sparta there was 2 kings who jointly shared the power. Lycurgus, according to Plutarch, was the younger son of one of these 2 kings. When slander about the motives of Lycurgus got out of hand, Lycurgus left Sparta and went to Crete, where he became familiar with the Cretan law code. Plutarch says Lycurgus met Homer and Thales on his travels. Eventually, the Spartans decided they needed Lycurgus back and persuaded him to return to Sparta. Lycurgus agreed to do so, but first he had to consult with the Delphic oracle. The advice of the oracle was so well respected that it would add authority to whatever was done in its name. The oracle said that the laws of Lycurgus would become the most famous in the world. Delphi, in legend previously called Pytho, was an ancient sacred precinct and the seat of Pythia, the major oracle who was consulted about important decisions throughout the ancient classical world. The oracle of Delphi, the Pythia, who was also referred to as the Sybil, was a priestess who would prophesy from the tripod in the sunken Adyton of the temple of Apollo. The god himself was believed to speak through this oracle. The ancient Greeks considered the center of the world to be in Delphi, marked by the stone monument known as the Omphalos of Delphi Navel. According to the Suda, Delphi took its name from the Delphine, the she-serpent, Dracaena, who lived there and was killed by the god Apollo. In other accounts, the serpent was the male serpent, Draken, Python. Once again, as shown in previous webisodes, there is a relationship and adoration of serpent-type gods. Delphi shares the same root with the Greek word for womb, Delphis. Pytho is related to Pythia, the priestess serving as the oracle, and to Python, a serpent or dragon who lived at the site. Pythia was the name of the high priestess of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. She specifically served as its oracle and was known as the Oracle of Delphi. During this period, the Delphic oracle was the most prestigious and authoritative oracle among the Greeks, and she was among the most powerful women of the classical world. The oracle is one of the best documented religious institutions of the classical Greeks. Authors who mention the oracle include Aeschylus, Aristotle, Clement of Alexandria, Diodorus, Diogenes, Euripides, Herodotus, Julian, Justin, Livy, Lucan, Nepos, Ovid, Pausanias, Pindar, Plato, Plutarch, Sophocles, Strabo, Thucydides, and Xenophon. In the book The Sybils, demystifying the absence of the African ancestress, the first prophetess of Mamiwata reads, African women are the only women in the world whose ancient mothers were not born under the yoke of patriarchy. During ancient times, for the first 6,000 years, Africa was ruled by a powerful order of matriarchs. Considering the current status of African women around the world today, one can hardly be convinced that her matriarchal presence and the enormous influence she wielded in the ancient world had far exceeded the limited physical, cultural, geographical, and political designations of which Africa and her religions are confined today. During her reign, African religions had reached very high levels of theological and ritual development, and were the original spiritual home of the world's first great oracles, prophetess, and prophets. Under the rising tide of African patriarchy, the sacerdotal order of Sybils were sold as slaves to build and work the powerful oracles they established in ancient Greece, Rome, Turkey, and Babylon. What is now currently the Holy Seat of the Vatican in Italy was originally the sacerdotal seat of these ancient Black Sybil Queen Mothers. Centuries before Christ, they were known to heal the sick, restore dignity and strength to the weak, and restore sight to the blind. They were famous for curing lameness, epileptics, deaf mutes, and lepers. They were said to cast out demons and even to raise up the dead. Their prophecies are the oldest and most authentic in the world. They were the basis for Greek and Roman tragedies and plays. More astonishing, their prophetic books were later collected by the Roman authorities, who needed a Western theological foundation in order to compete with the powerful Levitical Jews. These Sybil prophecies soon became the sole and undisputed precursor to the Western Christian Bible. As the first established, sacerdotal, African matriarchs, the Sybils' cultural and religious impact was arguably the most profound on ancient civilization than modern history has ever revealed or cared to admit. From Mesopotamia to Libya, Mizoram, Kemet/Egypt, Ionia, Minoa, Peloponnese, Turkey, and Mycenae, Greece, and later Rome, the Sybils were the primary, divine Vatican and absolute moral authority. The absence of African women's contribution in world history as major economic, political, and spiritual players, as opposed to exceptions to the norm or mere appendages of great men, has been problematic and disturbing at best. The Sybils were prophetesses or oracles in ancient Greece and prophesied at holy sites. A Sybil at Delphi has been dated to as early as the 11th century BC by Pausanias when he described local traditions in his writings from the 2nd century AD. At first, there appears to have been only a single Sybil. By the 4th century BC, there appear to have been at least 3 more, Phrygian, Erythraean, and Hellespontine. By the 1st century BC, there were at least 10 Sybils located in Greece, Italy, the Levant, and Asia Minor. The English word Sybil is from Middle English via the Old French Sibyl and the Latin Sibylla from the ancient Greek Sibylla. Varro derived the name from an Aeolic Theobulla, the equivalent of Attic Theobule meaning divine counsel. The first known Greek writer to mention a Sybil is based on the testimony of Plutarch, Heraclitus 500 BC. The Sybil, with frenzied mouth uttering things not to be laughed at, unadorned and unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years with her voice by aid of the god. Walter Burkert observes that frenzied women from whose lips the god speaks are recorded very much earlier in the Near East, as in Mari in the 2nd millennium and in Assyria in the 1st millennium. In Pausanias' description of Greece, the first Sybil at Delphi mentioned the former was of great antiquity, and was thought, according to Pausanias, to have been given the name Sybil by the Libyans. The Sybil who most concerned the Romans was the Cumaean Sybil, located near the Greek city of Naples, whom Virgil's Aeneas consults before his descent to the lower world, Aeneid Book 6:10. Burkert notes, 1985, page 117, that the conquest of Cumae by the Oscans in the 5th century destroyed the tradition, but provides a terminus antiquem for a Cumaean Sybil. She is said to have sold the original Sibylline books to Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. In Virgil's 4th Eclogue, the Cumaean Sybil foretells the coming of a savior, possibly a flattering reference to the poet's patron, Augustus. Christians later identified this savior as Jesus. The so-called Libyan Sybil was identified with prophetic priestesses presiding over the ancient Zeusamon oracle at the Siwa oasis in the western desert of Egypt. The oracle here was consulted by Alexander after his conquest of Egypt. The Persian Sybil was said to be a prophetic priestess presiding over the Apollonian oracle, although her location remained vague enough so that she might be called the Babylonian Sybil. The Persian Sybil is said to have foretold the exploits of Alexander the Great. Also named Sybils, she was reported to be of the family of the biblical Noah. The 2nd century AD traveler Pausanias, pausing at Delphi to enumerate 4 Sybils, mentions the Hebrew Sybil who was brought up in Israel named Sab, whose father was Berosus and her mother Aramanth. Some say she was a Babylonian, while others call her an Egyptian Sybil. The medieval Byzantine encyclopedia, the Suda, credits the Hebrew Sybil as author of the Sibylline oracles. The job of a priestess, especially the Pythia, was a respectable career for Greek women. Priestesses enjoyed many liberties and rewards for their social position, such as freedom from taxation, the right to own property and attend public events, a salary and housing provided by the state, a wide range of duties depending on their affiliation, and often gold crowns. Inscribed on a column in the forecourt of the temple were an enigmatic E and 3 maxims: 1. Know thyself, 2. Nothing to excess, and 3. Surety brings ruin, or make a pledge and mischief is nigh. The archaeologist John Hale reports that the Pythia was, on occasion, a noble of aristocratic family, sometimes a peasant, sometimes rich, sometimes poor, sometimes old, sometimes young. Sometimes a very lettered and educated woman to whom somebody like the high priest and the philosopher Plutarch would dedicate essays, other times who could not write her own name. So it seems to have been aptitude rather than any ascribed status that made these women eligible to be Pythias and speak for the god. With the oracle on his side, Lycurgus instituted changes in the Spartan government and provided Sparta with a constitution. In addition to changes to the government, Lycurgus altered the economy of Sparta, banning ownership of gold or silver and useless occupations. Lycurgus reformed Sparta socially too. Lycurgus started the state-run education system, including the training of women, the peculiar non-monogamous Spartan marriages, and the role of the state in deciding which newborn was fit to live. When it appeared to Lycurgus that all was being done according to his suggestions and that Sparta was on the right track, he told the Spartans that he had one more important mission. Until he returned, they were under oath not to change the laws. Then Lycurgus left Sparta and disappeared forever. Herodotus also says the Spartans thought the laws of Lycurgus came from Crete. Xenophon says Lycurgus made them up, while Plato says the Delphic oracle provided them. Regardless of their origin, the Delphic oracle played an important role in the acceptance of the laws of Lycurgus. Here's a passage from Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus on his obtaining an oracle from Delphi about the establishment of his form of government. When thou hast built a temple to Zeus Selenius and Athena Selenia, divided the people into phylae, and divided them into obai, and established a Gerousia of 30 including the Archagitae, then from time to time Apellasian between Babyca and Nakian, and there introduce and repeal measures, but the demos must have the decision and the power. At Sparta, the Carbon Organic Heraclids formed two dynasties ruling jointly, which is considered the double crown, being the Agiads and the Eurypontids. At Corinth, the Heraclids ruled as the Bacchiadi dynasty before the aristocratic revolution, which brought a Bacchiad aristocracy into power, and at Argos, the descendant of Heracles, Timanus, was the first king of Argos. At Macedonia, the Heraclids formed the Argead dynasty, whose name comes from Argos, as one of the Heraclids from this city, Perdiccas I, settled in Macedonia, where he founded his kingdom. By the time of Philip II, the family had expanded their reign further, to include, under the rule of Macedonia, all Upper Macedonian states. Their most celebrated members were Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great, under whose leadership the kingdom of Macedonia gradually gained predominance throughout Greece, defeated the Achaemenid Empire, and expanded as far as Egypt and India. The Sparta earthquake of 464 BC destroyed much of Sparta. The earthquake sparked a revolt of the hybrid Asian albino helots and carbon organic prisoners of war and debt slaves, who made up the slave class of Spartan society. In the immediate aftermath, the helots saw an opportunity to rebel. This was followed by the siege of Ithome, which the rebel helots had fortified. The pro-Spartan Cimon was successful in getting Athens to send help to put down the rebellion, but this would eventually backfire for the pro-Sparta movement in Athens. Events surrounding this revolt led to an increase in tension between Sparta and their rival Athens and the cancellation of a treaty between them. The Athenian hoplites that made up the bulk of the force were from the well-to-do section of Athenian society, and as we have discussed in previous webisodes, it was Athens where the hybrid Asian albinos whom had been civilized and through democracy and intermarriage with carbon organic tribes, families, and clans had ascended into the higher ranks of society. They were nevertheless openly shocked to discover that the helot rebels were fellow hybrid Asian albino Greeks like themselves. Sparta began to fear that the Athenian troops might make common cause with the rebels. The Spartans subsequently sent the Athenians home, providing the official justification that since the initial assault on Ithome had failed, what was now required was a blockade, a task the Spartans did not need Athenian help with. After the troops of a relief expedition dispatched by conservative Athenians were sent back with cold thanks, Athenian democracy itself fell into the hands of reformers and moved toward a more populist and anti-Spartan policy. Therefore, this earthquake is cited by historical sources as one of the key events that led up to the First Peloponnesian War between the two major powers in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 5th century BC, being hybrid mixed albino Athens and carbon organic Sparta. The Peloponnesian War would end by fundamentally shifting power in the Mediterranean, but neither Athens's navy nor Sparta's soldiers could claim to be the determining factor of the conflict. That honor belongs to an event that nobody could have predicted or planned for, the Plague of Athens, which broke out in the war's second year. A medical mystery to this day, this ancient epidemic would be the most influential factor to shape the war and decide which city-state would be the final victor. In spring 430 BC, locals in Piraeus, the port area of Athens, began to fall ill with a disease no one had seen before. The malady spread quickly. Reports circulated of similar outbreaks on the island of Lemnos, in the North Aegean, and other locations. In Piraeus, rumors spread that when the Spartans had arrived, they had poisoned the wells there so that drinking contaminated water sickened Athenians. In a matter of weeks, the disease had spread to the heart of the city and was affecting people of all ages and backgrounds and in unprecedented proportions. The strategy of the Athenian leader Pericles to bring people from rural Attica into the walled city of Athens only increased the rate of contagion. The illness, whatever it was, did not affect the Spartans to the same degree as the Athenians. In total, it is estimated that between 25 and 35% of the population of Athens would perish as a result of the plague when it ended 5 years later. The main source of information about the epidemic comes from the historian Thucydides, who not only witnessed the events firsthand, but survived the disease himself. In his history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides believes the plague originated in eastern Africa, in the lands of ancient Ethiopia, present-day Sudan. From there, the sickness traveled north to Egypt and Libya and east to the Persian Empire before reaching Greece. Early in his account, Thucydides writes, "I shall give a statement of what it was like, which people can study in case it should ever attack again." His descriptions chart how the disease progressed in its victims. From the first symptoms, people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and forwarded breath. Symptoms included sneezing and hoarseness before the disease attacked the chest, causing the hard cough, and then the stomach, where it triggered discharges of bile, ineffectual retching, and violent spasms. By this point, the victim was in very great distress. Thucydides describes the appearance of the patient's skin, reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. Sufferers described intense fevers, feeling as though a fire was consuming them inside, so they would remove all their clothes. They experienced an unquenchable thirst, which led some to plunge themselves into water tanks as well. Extreme insomnia followed. The plague had a radical effect on Athenian society. Traditional hierarchies were turned upside down. Wealthy citizens might see their livelihoods destroyed from one day to the next, while poor ones might get rich by appropriating a dead man's assets. Thucydides describes how moral conventions were abandoned and people tended to live each day as if it were their last. As the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. Nobody feared justice, as death by plague seemed more imminent than any pending court case. Spiritual concerns loomed large as well. Many believed something had angered the gods, who unleashed the disease as punishment. According to Thucydides, the elders spoke of an ancient oracle that had predicted a great epidemic would ensue after a Dorian war. The Spartans were Dorians, descendants of an ancient Carbon Organic people who had settled in the Peloponnese. It was also rumored that the Spartans had consulted the oracle at Delphi about the outcome of the war. Through prophecy, the god Apollo had promised his support to Sparta. The Athenians themselves sought counsel of the gods and sent emissaries to Delphi and other sanctuaries for divine guidance on the epidemic. Overwhelmed by the impact of the plague on their loved ones and on their way of life, Athenians began to turn against their leader, Pericles. While the move may have seemed practical at the time, with hindsight, his war strategy of encouraging the population to shelter from Sparta's attacks within Athens' city walls had worsened the sanitary conditions in the city. As Thucydides records, an aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the country into the city, and this was especially felt by the new arrivals. As there were no houses to receive them, they had to be lodged at the hot season of the year in stifling cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. The epidemic greatly weakened Athens and brought an end to its golden age. By the time the plague ended around 425 BC, it is estimated that nearly a third of the city's people died, with between 75,000 to 100,000 lives lost. Sparta and Athens would strike a truce around 421 BC. Sparta would ultimately win the Peloponnesian War, destroying the Athenian fleet at sea in 405 BC. The defeat of Athens by Sparta resulted in Spartan hegemony in the early 4th century BC. The Peloponnesian Wars were the protracted armed conflicts, waged on sea and land, of the last half of the 5th century BC between the Delian League, controlled by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, dominated by Sparta, over control of the other Greek city-states. Scholars often call the Delian League the Athenian Empire. The Peloponnesian League believed it was defending itself against Athenian aggrandizement. The war had ethnic overtones that generally, but not always, applied. The Delian League included populations of Athenians and Ionians whom were admixtured tribes with Yamnaya steppe ancestry and the Carbon Organic peoples they had mixed in with on their descent south, while the Peloponnesian League was mainly of unmixed Carbon Organic Dorians, except that a third power, the Boeotians, had sided tentatively with the Peloponnesian League. They were never fully trusted by the Spartans. Ethnic animosity was fueled by the forced incorporation of small Carbon Organic ruled Dorian states into the Delian League, who appealed to Sparta. Motivations, however, were complex, including local politics and considerations of wealth, much like in today's society where Carbon Organic members of Western societies ignore ethnic cohesion for wealth or political reasons. As Carbon Organic Spartan citizenship was inherited by blood, being they refused to mix their genealogies as mentioned in previous webisodes, Sparta now increasingly faced a predominantly hybrid Asian albino Helot population that vastly outnumbered its citizens. The alarming decline of Spartan citizens was commented on by Aristotle, who viewed it as a sudden event. While some researchers view it as a result of war casualties, it appears that the number of citizens, after a certain point, started declining steadily at a rate of 50% reduction every 50 years regardless of the extent of battles. Historians, in avoiding the historical ethnicities of the region, say it was likely this was the result of steady shifting of wealth among the citizen body, which was simply not as obvious until laws were passed allowing the citizens to give away their land plots. But there was also the eventual miscegenation that ended up taking place, and though the title of Spartans died out, the organic rulers existed in the lines that eventually ruled from Macedon. The Battle of Megalopolis was fought in 331 BC between Spartan-led forces and Macedonia. Alexander's regent Antipater led the Macedonians to victory over King Agis III. Alexander, warring in Asia at the time, called it a Battle of Mice, according to Plutarch. In the autumn of 333 BC, the Spartan king Agis III had met with the Persian commanders Pharnabazus and Autophrodates somewhere in the Aegean Sea, and revealed to them his plans for a war against Alexander and Greece itself. The Persians agreed to support Agis, however, they could only spare for him 30 talents and 10 ships. Agis also recruited the Greek mercenary survivors of the Battle of Issus, who had served in the Persian army, a force of 8,000 veterans. In the summer of 331 BC, Agis defeated Coragus, the Macedonian general in command of the Peloponnese and the garrison of Corinth. Agis asked for help from the Peloponnesians and Athens, though Athens refused to help the Spartans. Meanwhile, Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, was occupied in Thrace, where the Macedonian general, Memnon, was involved in a rebellion. After the rebellion was resolved, Antipater marched against King Agis. Antipater had recruited a large force, over 40,000 strong, with a core of Macedonian troops and substantial numbers of tribal warriors from the northern fringes of Macedonia, reinforced with troops from his Greek allies. Antipater received aid from Alexander of 3,000 talents to support in what Arrian names the Lacedaemonian-Spartan War. The final battle, fought near Megalopolis in Arcadia, ended in defeat for the Spartans. Early in the battle, Antipater's lines broke, but in the end it was the sheer weight of numbers that brought victory to the Macedonians. It is written that 5,300 died on the Spartan side and 3,500 on the Macedonian side, though it may have been as little as 1,000 for the Macedonians. Curtius agrees that there were 5,300 Spartans killed. For the Spartans, that meant a death toll of over 25%. King Agis, now wounded and unable to stand, ordered his men to leave him behind to face the advancing Macedonian army so that he could buy his men time to retreat. Diodorus states that the Spartan king slew several enemy soldiers before being finally killed by a javelin. After the battle, Antipater remained apart from the peace talks, which did not please Alexander, instead leaving it to the Peloponnesians to organize their own peace terms. Macedonia, also called Macedon, was an ancient kingdom on the periphery of archaic and classical Greece, which later became the dominant state of Hellenistic Greece. The kingdom was founded and initially ruled by the royal Argead dynasty, which was followed by the Antipatrid and Antigonid dynasties. The name Macedonia comes from the ethnonym Magdones, which itself is derived from the ancient Greek adjective makednos, meaning tall, slim, also the name of a people related to the Dorians, Herodotus, and descriptive of ancient Macedonians. It is most likely cognate with the adjective makros, meaning long or tall in ancient Greek. The name is believed to have originally meant highlanders, the tall ones, or high-grown men. Linguist Robert S. P. Beeks claims that both terms are of pre-Greek substrate origin and cannot be explained in terms of Indo-European morphology. The classical Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides reported the legend that the Macedonian kings of the Argead dynasty were descendants of Timanus, king of Argos, and could therefore claim the mythical Heracles as one of their ancestors, as well as a direct lineage from Zeus, chief god of the Greek pantheon. The assertion that the Argeads descended from Timanus was accepted by the Hellenodikai authorities of the ancient Olympic Games, permitting Alexander I of Macedon, 498 to 454 BC, to enter the competitions owing to his perceived Greek heritage. In regard to the genetics of the people whom now reside in the region, we can determine as follows. The more moderate Macedonian position, generally adopted by better educated Macedonians and publicly endorsed by Kiro Glogorov, the first president of the newly independent Republic of Macedonia, is that modern Macedonians have no relation to Alexander the Great, but are a Slavic people whose ancestors arrived in Macedonia in the 6th century AD in response to Macedonian political and diaspora organizations' claims of direct descent to Alexander the Great. Glogorov stated several times that the ethnic Macedonians are unrelated to the ancient Macedonians, as well as that they are a South Slavic people. In an interview with the Toronto Star on March 15, 1992, he said, "We are Macedonians, but we are Slav Macedonians. That's who we are. We have no connection to Alexander the Great and his Macedonia. The ancient Macedonians no longer exist. They had disappeared from history a long time ago. Our ancestors came here in the 5th and 6th century AD. According to paper, HLA Genes and Macedonians and the Sub-Saharan Origin of the Greeks by Arnais Valena, published February 2001 by authors Arnais Valena, K. Dimitrowski, A. Pacho, J. Moscoso, E. Gomez Casado, C. Silveira Redondo, P. Varela, M. Blagoevska, V. Zdravkovska, J. Martinez Lasso for the Department of Immunology and Molecular Biology, Universidad Complutense, Madrid, Spain. It reads LA alleles have been determined in individuals from the Republic of Macedonia by DNA typing and sequencing. HLA-A, B, DR, DQ allele frequencies and extended haplotypes have been for the first time determined, and the results compared to those of other Mediterraneans, particularly with their neighboring Greeks. Genetic distances, neighbor-joining dendrograms, and correspondence analysis have been performed. The following conclusions have been reached. 1. Macedonians belonged to the older Mediterranean substratum, like Iberians, including Basques, North Africans, Italians, French, Cretans, Jews, Lebanese, Turks, Anatolians, Armenians, and Iranians. 2. Macedonians are not related with geographically close Greeks, who do not belong to the older Mediterranean substratum. 3. Greeks are found to have a substantial relatedness to Sub-Saharan, Ethiopian, people, which separate them from other Mediterranean groups. Both Greeks and Ethiopians share quasi-specific DRB1 alleles. Genetic distances are closer between Greeks and Ethiopian/Sub-Saharan groups than to any other Mediterranean group, and finally, Greeks cluster with Ethiopians/Sub-Saharans in both neighbor joining dendrograms and correspondence analyses. The time period when these relationships might have occurred was ancient but uncertain and might be related to the displacement of Egyptian Ethiopian people living in Pharaonic Egypt. In the report, we can conclude that the Macedonians that are considered as belonging to the older Mediterranean substratum are the original carbon organic genealogies who were the ruling tribes, families, and clans of African and Asiatic stock, whom were the progenitors of all the various other groups mentioned. 2. The older substratum of Macedonians are not related with the Greeks, who are Hellenes, and do not belong to the older substratum of the ancient tribes such as the Pelasgians, Danans, Cadmonites, and Carians, and the many other carbon organic tribes from ancient Kushite Africa and the Kushite Babylonians under varying tribal names who ruled in the peninsula from time immemorial. One final point in regards to the Dorians cum Spartans is revealed within an exchange of letters. In the Deuterocanonical first book of Maccabees expresses a Jewish claim to kinship with the Spartans, Arius king of the Lacedaemonians to Onias the high priest, greeting, it is found in writing that the Lacedaemonians and Jews are brethren, and that they are of the stock of Abraham. Now therefore, since this has come to our knowledge, ye shall do well to write unto us of your prosperity. We do write back again to you, that your cattle and goods are ours, and ours are yours. Authorized King James Version 1 Maccabees 12.20. The letters are reproduced in a variant form by Josephus. We will explore this further in our next webisode, Carbon Organic Hebrews Founded Western Civilization. On the next episode, as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our past to create a better blueprint for the future for all fallen humanity. This series, The Claim of Thrones, will take you on a journey through the universe, across the galactic heavens to the eventual seeding of the planet Earth. This series will also cover the hidden realities of how humanity came about, the various cataclysms and restarts, and follow the various bloodlines of indigenous rights of inheritance. This narrative sets the sacred record straight in regards to who's who on the planet Earth and begins the journey of the lawful reversion and restitution for the heirs of Mother Earth. If you like this content, please subscribe and hit the notification button, as well as support across our many social media platforms.